back on the unemployment rate and drive it up again. In terms of COVID, there's just like everything else, a sharp divide. Look at the trend line once it hit when they're asked whether the COVID virus is more to come or less to come. You can see they've converged with where we are right now, and obviously straight along party lines. Republicans think that the worst is behind us, and Democrats think the worst is to come. And independents, that's why they're independent, right in the middle. This was a survey done about a week ago by ABC and Washington Post, which compared Florida and Arizona because these are two critical swing states. But here again, you can see Florida specifically as the economy number one, the virus number two, crime or law and order three, almost tied with racial equity, and then healthcare is a little bit lagging. However, the Supreme Court is getting ready to take up the affordable health care constitutional arguments before the election's over. So that issue may elevate for people that have not yet voted. Obviously, Trump does better in terms of the economy, and the Democrats do better. Biden does better when it's voters that could care about most about the COVID. The ABC poll also showed the issues that are pluses for each of the candidates and those that are just kind of in the middle. But there's a new poll out today, which if you haven't seen it yet, it was done by Suffolk University and USA Today, which shows Florida is even up right now. And it was done, I didn't have time to get the crosstabs in here, but it was done after he went in the hospital on Friday, the president. And it really does show that Trump's miserable performance, and both of them for that matter in the debate, really hadn't stuck. And so interesting things along that line for Florida. We're one of 8 key states, 3 in the South, us, Georgia, and North Carolina. Then you have the Midwest, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota, and Pennsylvania, and the only far west state is Arizona. But these are really where most of the dollars are being spent. And in case you haven't seen any ads on TV yet, you just haven't been watching TV. They're already estimating that this election is going to cost $11 billion on ads by the candidates and the parties and PACs. And we're going to see a lot of them here. It's not news that both parties from the get-go have seen Florida as critical. These quotes were taken at the end of 2019. Both parties regard Florida as a must-have for slightly different reasons. Democrats could win without Florida, but they're also thinking that if Biden does well here and it affects down ballot races, that maybe Democrats might be able to take over one chamber of the legislature because redistricting comes up in 2 years from now. So slightly different reasons. Of course, Trump can't win without our state. We've been a toss-up state from the first moment they started constructing these maps, and it hasn't changed a bit. And we're still that way. Remember, 4 elections prior to 2018, the 2010 and 14 were governors, and the 2012 and 16 were presidential, but the commonality is they all just had a 1% margin of victory. So some people are still referring to us as the 1% state, but frankly, now we're the 0.5% state as a consequence of 2018, where we had 6 races, 3 statewide and 3 legislative, go to recounts triggered by the 0.5 or less trigger margin. And so this is why no one is really predicting a blowout in our state, not from these past experiences anyway. We still remain the most diverse state for a lot of reasons that are actually becoming more important, and we're becoming more rather than less diverse, particularly when it comes to race and ethnicity and age. But obviously, we're the biggest state in terms of swing states that can affect the outcome. We have almost 11%. of the Electoral College votes needed to secure the presidency. So when we look at all these demographic makeups that are really detailed, you're going to see why it's hard to really figure out how to reach Floridians in a way that allows you to win an election. Micro-targeting is to the nth degree. It's almost micro-targeting necessary in our state anymore. And this is what shocked a lot of people. Right now, there's almost less than 1% difference between registered Democrats and Republicans. Republicans continued to register voters from the last election. Democrats were counting on all this big money coming in at the beginning of this year with foundations and PACs and so forth, and then COVID hit. But I watch mostly that bottom line, which is the people who are turning their backs on both parties. If you just look at these numbers, these were as of September the 1st. The other numbers aren't out yet, the September numbers per se. But just look at the, 5,203,795 Democrat, 5,020,199 for Republicans. There is no state that looks anywhere near Florida. We're the biggest and the most competitive. That makes us the most important and biggest swing state. We're also very diverse and getting more so by the day. The Hispanics now share of the electorate. These are actual registered voters, it's 17, Blacks 13, Asians 2, and other, which would be increasingly biracial or multiracial individuals. So the white proportion of our electorate is actually shrinking. And the projections are that that's a demographic trend that is only going to continue. And what we're seeing here in Florida, we're sort of ahead of the country in some of these diversity trends, particularly the racial and ethnic diversity. It's also true that Hispanics and Asians are less tied to a political party than are Black or white voters. And you particularly see even among Asian registrants that more of them register as no party affiliation than with either party. And it's pretty close within Hispanics. And of course, there's some differences that are very important. Right now, Biden's having severe trouble with Latino votes in Florida. And part of it is his team has not recognized the diversity of our Hispanic population and that their politics and culture and priorities are not the same. And so they've really had to try to make up some speed. That's why he was in Miami yesterday. But we have the most diverse, by far the most diverse Hispanic population of any state. And we also have a tremendously diverse Black population, which we in our area don't notice so much as you would if you were in Southeast Florida, where there's a large Caribbean presence. And that's again why Biden went to talk to the Haitians yesterday. They voted for Trump in 2016. He's trying to move them over to the Democratic side. But again, Caribbean-born Black registrants often differ in their priorities in politics from American-born Blacks. So that adds another element of micro-targeting necessity in our state. The same pattern is true among Florida's Asian population. And depending on what part of the state you're in, you can see different concentrations of countries of origin of all these Blacks, Asians, and Hispanics. But turnout, again, this is why let me get a cup of coffee here real quick. I'm talking too much, I guess. But you can see here that Latino turnout is a problem, and it always is. And yet it's a growing share of Florida's electorate. It's why both parties, frankly, are scrambling to ramp up turnout among Florida Hispanics. But to me, I'm always interested in the age diversity of Florida. And you see here under 50 population is 45%, almost half of our registrants. But I like to look at it, some of you know this, that I prefer to look at age from a generational perspective, where you can actually break out the events that have mattered in the maturation of that generation. So if you look at Gen Z, which we call the hashtag generation, Look at the events that have occurred since they've started turning 18 and eligible to vote. And if you look at it, they've seen two presidents, one from each party. And if you really looked at how they felt about Congress, it is absolutely in the almost single digits in terms of favorability. So they are the ones more likely to turn their backs on parties, even though in our state they do lean a bit more Democratic, but still around 40% of our younger registrants are registering as the ones that are choosing a party as Republicans. So it's not quite as one-sided as the press likes you to think. But anyway, you can see all the differences going up the line there. And from generation X, millennial, and Z compared to the boomers, their whole means of communication, computers and everything else have come in, and you can't even reach them in the same way that you can reach older voters. So this is, I think, more telling. And we won't know these percentages might go up slightly depending upon this late generation rush to younger generation rush to register at the last minute. But still, almost a third of our registrants are these two youngest generations. And when you put Generation X, the three youngest are well over half of Florida's registrants. And I can't tell you the number of times that out-of-state journalists come and call me, because I've been doing this so long that I know a lot of the people that are still working for various news outlets. And they call me and they say, hey, I'm coming to Florida. Can you help me find some older voters to interview? And I'm no, really, you should be thinking more about the younger ones, because they're going to be the difference in Florida. If they vote, they're likely to, and they're cohesive in their voting, they're likely to push it in one direction or another. And they actually cost Hillary Florida in 2016 when they didn't vote because they were Sanders people. So we'll see. But you and the physicians, business, and so forth also need to really begin to get a feel for the intersection between age and racial composition. So right now, Florida's Generation Z voters are a majority non-white. And this is a pattern that we're seeing all across the country. But we have it in terms of data. Most people have only looked at this from a population perspective, but we're seeing it already in the electorate itself. And this isn't a particularly good measure of turnout. 2018 was a midterm election. Young people really kind of passed that by. The gap between turnout of older and younger will be narrower this time. The question is just how much narrower, especially with college kids not on campus, but online. And usually campuses are the glue that sort of sticks activism together. So I'm really kind of watching the outreach that's being done to reach younger voters, which, by the way, texting is not real popular with them when you flood their phones with text messages, as some political folks are finally starting to figure out. Women have been the majority of our electorate, and it's true nationally. What we're seeing is that increasingly, it's still small, but people who are refusing binary definitions of gender. And this is something you're going to start seeing bubble up in a lot of places. Some states already permit on your voter registration file that you can pick other categories of gender. Florida will ultimately get there, but we're not there yet, but we're already starting to see it start to surface. It is true that there's a difference between men and women's politics. More women in Florida are registered as Democrats and more men as Republicans, and more of the unknown genders as no party affiliation. So you see some very sharp patterns there, but there's nowhere that the gender gap is bigger than within the Democratic Party of Florida. And look at the huge difference between registered Democrats in terms of women, 58%, and men, 39%. Among Republicans, there's a slight edge to women, but almost equal. And minor parties, which would be like libertarians and so forth, lean more male, and NPAs a little bit tied as well. But the sharp gender difference is in Florida's Democratic Party. It's also a party that a majority of Florida's registered Democrats are non-white. A lot of people don't realize that either. So a lot of the women's Democrats are women of color. And you can see within the Black community, the Hispanic community, and Asian communities, a big, big gender gap. And people, it explains why you see a lot more women, minority women running for local offices and state legislative races and even congressional. And there's one simple answer for it, and that's because it's women of color that are going to college and not their male counterparts. It's education that's really the distinction in that pattern. But it's also true that women turn out to vote at a higher rate than men. And so both parties are targeting the women voter very, very carefully. I think this is a pattern that no one in this room really needs to be told about it, but it reflects the rural, urban, and suburban divide that's also a characteristic of us as a swing state. The darker the red, the heavier the margin of victory for a Republican. The darker the blue, the larger the margin for a Democratic candidate for governor in 2018. The lighter colors are where the margin is narrower. So if I just draw a line here about the I-4 corridor, you'll notice you got the lighter shades, the more suburban areas that are often the swing part of the state, and the outlying areas of the metro media markets are darker. But this is why Florida, the I-4 corridor is so important, because these two markets, Tampa and Orlando, together have 45% of Florida's registered voters. And we're the biggest here in Tampa. So we're 1/4 of all Florida's registered voters can watch television in Tampa. It's that big a market. And shockingly, no, it isn't. But Orlando and Tampa are also the two markets where there's the most even divide between the two parties. So if you're wondering why people say that winning the I-4 corridor is going to heaven and losing it is hell, that's pretty much the case. And it also explains why more money is being spent in ads in these markets and why the candidates are coming here when they can more often, even though now there's an emphasis on going to Southeast Florida with the Latino vote. These are the least partisan, and you say, well, they look pretty even to me. Well, that just shows again the divide. But the two most Democratic-dominated Democratic markets are college towns, Tallahassee and Gainesville, and then Miami, Fort Lauderdale. The most Republican, it was that dark, dark red Panhandle where there's a lot of military personnel, retirees there. And the biggest one of the Republican-dominated markets is the Naples-Fort Myers market. But even here, you can't really target in the same way across these markets. If you look at Miami, the third market there, you'll notice that only 30% of the registrants in that media market are white, and everyone else is a person. There are Hispanics, 41%, Blacks, 20%. There's no other market like that. And you take a contrast of Panama City, and you really see that media markets are increasingly the way that candidates formulate their strategies in terms of buying, designing ads, figuring out where candidates go, where you raise money, what message you give, because one size doesn't fit all. And this is why it's about now up to $13 or $14 million to keep one ad up for 1 week in all of our 10 media markets. It's just, we're a money pit. And of course, right now, the TV stations are loving it, as you might imagine. So quickly here to look at who, when you hear that this is a base election, you hear that quite a bit. So who are typically what we regard as the base for Florida Democrats? It's these groups. It doesn't mean that there aren't some of these that are more Republican in their voting, but these are a larger share of all of these groups of voters lean Democrat. So that's why they're called the base constituencies. For Florida Republicans, here you get the geographical sort of part of their base, the suburban and rural areas, which are higher turnout, by the way, than urban areas, even though urban areas are larger. You see a different kind of Hispanic voter. These are the voters that are really driven by anti-socialist candidates. They don't want anyone that smacks of socialism. And this was a group that Biden was trying to appeal to yesterday. It's going to be a hard sell, though, because these voters, this pattern started in the 2018 governor's race. The swing voters are always the suburban woman, and she votes the concerns of her children. So we're really watching how these women are looking at the whole school situation, you know, going to school or staying home. It's also true that if you look at who has been most likely to lose a job, it's been the working suburban mom that's lost a job because of the economy. So we're really watching how they end up going. But I'm always interested in who doesn't like either one of these parties. I love this description of it because it's pretty much this succinct feeling of NPAs. But there are, frankly, different reasons why some people just turn their backs on the two parties. Some of it's professional, you know, certain professions. Increasingly, it's business people that don't want to be tagged by a potential customer as being of the wrong political persuasion. And then, of course, with a lot of the new arrived Puerto Ricans, where they come from a country where their two parties are statehood or no statehood. And so when they get here, they don't really know. So they just register as no parties, somewhat similar for Asian second and first generations that register. And then you've got some people that are just absolutely opposed to two parties, and those that just intensely dislike both parties, which tends to be younger voters, as we'll see. There's a straight line progression here. The older you are, the more likely you are to be, you know, a party, affiliate with a party. The younger you are, the more interested you are in registering as no party affiliation. And that number continues to go up. And they're a hard demographic to reach. That's why every business, Starbucks to the NBA to whatever, has all these ads encouraging younger people to go vote because they want them to buy their products. But they feel like that the direction of the country politically is going to be a lot in the hands of this youngest generation, and they're trying to lay the foundation for their own businesses as well. We've already passed one debate. The president just said this morning he's going to this one next week in Miami. We'll see. But the vice presidential debate is this week, and I'll come back to it in a minute. But the stage that we're in terms of the campaigns is frantic time because people are already voting. Well over 500,000 Floridians have already voted. So they're tuning out everything. But we have 14 million registered voters. And so there's not a lot of time now to get people's attention before they vote, because a lot of people just vote to get it over with and not have to listen to any of it anymore. And then I feel most sympathetic with the people that are running the elections. The supervisors of elections have the toughest job in politics, and they're all on the ballot this year because we're electing constitutional officers. Not only do they have cybersecurity problems that are looming, but they already know that we're going to see record numbers of lawsuits filed. People are already predicting this is going to be the most litigious election ever. But we're hopeful that maybe other states have more problems than us for a change. I know that's what the supervisors are hoping, but it's still, we know there are problems. I thought you would enjoy I love these word game things. It shows people's reaction to the first presidential debate. I'm sure some of you might be able to find one of those terms that expresses how you felt about it. But it really did hurt Trump momentarily in the polls, even though it seems now that it's gone by the wayside after the COVID, but it was a mess. The one Wednesday tomorrow is really, in my judgment, probably equal to the presidential debates, because everyone agrees that it could be the case that in the middle of the next president's term, whomever, that their VP may very well have to step in and become president because of health issues or so forth. And a lot of people have said that they're tuning into this one because, unlike the first one, when they wanted to hear some issue contrast, they didn't hear any of that. They heard personal attacks. They're hopeful that Susan Page, who's the Washington bureau chief for USA Today, who's the moderator, will get these two to focus more on issues and to enlighten people that are simply on the edge, that are really thinking that this will be key to them making up their minds about what direction they're going to go in. So I expect this will probably be the most watched VP debate ever. So we're left now with the challenges of how you get political news to voters who have become very cynical about news, very cynical about anything put out by parties. They don't rely upon the same sources for their information. And this is a good graphic here. This was done by the Pew Research Center. You can see young people get most of their political news from social media. On the other hand, the other end, you see older people, it's still print and network television. But finding out how to spend your money and your ads and designing it, this is again why it costs a lot of money, is you can't reach people in the same way with the same technology, nor the same message whatsoever. And there was a poll that came out last week, which I think some of you can identify with. Now over half of Americans say that they think every political ad should be banned from any social media. So what does that tell you? It feels like people are getting overloaded with social media, even though you see that a really key age contingency is still relying upon it. Another problem we have is that nobody thinks anybody's telling the truth. The candidates, no. The press, no. Is there bias? Yes. Even that's one thing they sort of agree on, is that there is bias in the news, even though Republicans see a bit more than Democrats, but still Democrats at 79% see a fair amount or a lot. This is why things got out of hand when the president went in the hospital. You had certain social medias and certain outlets projecting that it was all for politics, or, all kinds of memes going out. And then you have supporters of Trump saying, well, it was fake news that he went in there for that. This is the status that we're in right now. And it's really damaging for people really wanting to be informed about the election, even if they want to be. But just a quick rundown here. We have some very important congressional and state legislative races in Florida. We have two of the really, really competitive congressional races right here in our media market. The one down in Sarasota between Vern Buchanan and Margaret Good, and the one in sort of the East Hillsborough and Polk, which would be the race between Alan Cohn and Mr. Franklin. And one of those could flip in either direction, and it could be a net no gain for either party. But there's about 5 congressional races in Florida that are regarded highly competitive. The most competitive are the ones down in Miami. And we only have a couple really competitive House races across the state, but we have some pretty good Senate races. And there is a possibility that if Democrats, for example, if it were a real strong Biden win and it went all the way down the ticket, you could see that for the first time in a long time, maybe Florida Democrats gain control of one chamber. It's not likely to be the House. If anything, it's the Senate. And a lot of people think that's even an uphill battle, but who knows? I mean, there are some very, very high dollars being spent in Senate races and congressional races in our state. Then we have these 6 constitutional amendments. There's one of the polls out today suggests that the only one that was in trouble was number 4. But I also think that one of the most erroneously worded and described one is number 3, because it's not really an open primary. Open primaries are where you have both parties, but the NPAs can pick which party's primary they want to vote on. This is where everybody goes in the same list. So if you had 10 candidates for governor and 4 Democrats and 2 Republicans and 3 Libertarians, the top 2 vote getters go to the general. So you can have general elections then where it would only be your choice between candidates from the same party. But the ballot language is so confusing that most people think, oh, all voters vote. That sounds terrific. And yet, and African Americans have come out against this, where they say it submerges Black vote and is violative of the Voting Rights Act. We might see lawsuits about that. But of course, the business community is pushing hard not to pass a minimum wage. That's a tough sell. Economically, it's easy to understand the argument. If you're a person not making the minimum wage, it's a tougher sell. Not much controversy in 5 and 6, but none of these are getting a lot of attention because everything, all the ad time and money is being sucked out by the presidential and the congressional and Senate races. So quickly here, this was the pattern before this election. We were already seeing a lot of people voting before election day, but now the real story here is on vote by mail. Fortunately, Florida's been ahead of the game on this. We're way ahead of a lot of states that are clueless as to what's going to happen. Example, and one of the things that's been confusing because the president hasn't been able to articulate it very well, but if you look at these top 2 lists here, these are where automatically anyone who's registered to vote is sent an absentee ballot, whether they ask for it or not. This is where you're starting to see stories surface about people finding wads of them in the trash cans at an apartment complex where, you know, people move a lot and the rolls have not been cleaned up and are not caught up with them. And the chances for fraud are much greater in that kind of situation than they are in states like ours, where you have to simply ask for a ballot before you can vote by mail. Plus, we're one of a handful of states that lets people fix mistakes and to track their vote by mail ballot. And for the first time, this time out, we are also using those drop boxes, which are good if somebody doesn't trust the mail, which we have a lot of people don't, but they don't want to go into a facility to vote in person, either early voting or election day. Drop boxes at early voting sites. A person who has a vote by mail ballot can simply drive by or put it in a vote, ballot box, and that's a big improvement that I think is our television station is now starting to really, and others as well, push this idea so that people are aware of the availability of those drop boxes and the convenience of them if they're worried about contracting COVID or getting out of the car or whatever else. Why can't we predict Florida? Well, we've given you a lot of good reasons, but especially number 2 on the list. And by the way, on the first one, we don't know how many New Yorkers have moved down here. We haven't gotten the latest, registration figures to be available. And book closings were yesterday. Well, they've been probably open. I haven't seen if they've extended it or not. So we won't really know, but there's a lot of people who moved in here in the last couple of years. But I think more important, the most difficult thing is, with a snap of a finger, the item that people are focused on changes, and we call that news saturation. So going into the sort of the last front, so to speak, it was the economy and COVID. But I had always put, you don't know what's going to be dominant at the time people vote. And no sooner had I put this slide out than we have a Supreme Court justice die and we have a vacancy on the court. And then a week later, we have the president hospitalized with COVID. So I read a great account yesterday where somebody was saying, look, there's still time for at least 3 more October surprises. And I'm thinking, oh, please, I think we've all pretty much had it, But anyway, the generational divide and polling accuracy, which I don't think Florida has a good reputation for accurate polling here, but a lot of times the polling is done with all kinds of caveats. So like today, if you pick up today's papers or go online to Sapient, you'll see a poll came out by University of North Florida, which showed one thing, and the Suffolk USA showing another. Well, the UNF poll was done before the president went in the hospital, and the USA Today poll was done after he went in the hospital. And that's what I always have to tell people. Polls are just snapshots in time. But almost every poll of ours, here it shows you, have been within margin of error, which is basically a tie. So as of yesterday, by the time you add in the Suffolk poll at the top, which was a tie, and UNF, which was a Biden up by 6, which was a totally online poll, and the other one is more of a hybrid approach to it, which I favor. But anyway, all of these are frankly a tie. It's just that you can't get newspaper reporters to learn stats well enough to write the headline that this is an even up race. But this is Florida, and again, it's tight here. So I'm going to end with what I see right now are the challenges for each party as we head towards November 3rd. These would be problem areas that I see that are reflected in a lot of the polls and so forth and anecdotes and so. But for Democrats, they're still struggling to win back working class whites, especially males. We've already talked about the Latinos and also the Black moms for school choice, which helped elect DeSantis in 2018. They're the reason when you see increases in Black voters supporting a Republican, it's usually over school choice. And then for Republicans, it's clearly white college educated women and senior voters who are a little alienated by the president's tone and demeanor. We just don't know how many of them there are. But of course, the big question mark is the suburban woman voter, which Republicans are not doing particularly well with at the moment. But each of them also has a huge, huge turnout challenge. And for the Democrats, it's the younger voters, especially the young progressives. That would be the millennials and the Gen Zers. And then on the Republican side, it's moderates and never Trumpers who the best thing that Republicans can hope for in some regards is that they just stay home, that they don't cross over, but or they're trying to figure out how to ramp that turnout up among moderates who are sort of on the fence about which direction to go in. So I'll end with this. This is all I can predict with accuracy. This is kind of right back where we were 20 years ago, which we had 537 votes separated the two in Florida and kept the nation in anxiety for a month and a half practically. So I hope that gives you a little bit of a pretty broad-based feel about how we're looking at the election now, a little bit about our demographics and how what issues are pushing them and some of the big challenges. So I'll be happy to take any questions. If anybody, I can't tell you who's going to win, obviously.
That's some awesome stuff that you just provided, and Lord willing, and the creek don't rise, I'll be in a Caribbean island on election day, so that'll be
good for you.
But do we have? Sam's been fielding some questions. I see your hand up, Al. What do you have?
So the first question comes to mind about the Electoral College. What do you think they're going to do about that? Do you think there will ever be a debate as to doing away with it?
I doubt it. There'll be a debate about it if they lose. It'll take a constitutional amendment, which is proposed by Congress, and then has to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. And if you're talking now about adding 2 more states, which is what some people are talking about, if Democrats run the table, they're going to add more members of the Supreme Court and add 2 more states to water down the Republicans. And don't know how that's playing real well for people. I haven't seen a lot of polling on that. But nonetheless, it's still a long haul because smaller states will realize that that they will not get a lot of attention at all with the revisions of the Electoral College.
Right. So another question, Kim, is kind of a little bit of a long one, but the disconnect between the economy, the graph on the economy, and then people's concern about the virus. Do you think there's a they don't really understand that the economy needs to come back, and
you and I know that, but in reading a lot of accounts of working class voters all across this country, they just don't see that as one and the same particularly. And it's that working class Anglo particularly that is skeptical of linking the COVID with the economy, because they just have these beliefs about COVID that are, not, I'd say, mainstream at the moment, but they are among those groups. But I clearly see if COVID continues to spike, or if it goes and spikes here, which would, and if you see a lot more businesses other than Disney, but that's a pretty big one, starting to just lay off people. And, that can clearly push undecided voters towards Democrats in our state. On the other hand, if something happens with an international event, a terrorist event, or a law and order of the magnitude of Kenosha, where it's a smaller town that's affected, that moves people, I think, more towards Trump. And I'm talking there, it would probably move some of the senior voters who are leaning Biden back to Trump, because senior voters are the most vulnerable to crime and the most fearful of unrest.
So do we know anything about the extent to which voters registered in one party actually flip over and vote for the candidate in the other party? Is it a big percent or a little percent?
It's increasingly smaller than it has been because we're so polarized, and we won't know until the exit polls are done.
I see.
And those are questionable too. We in social science rely a lot of them because that's the only way you can tell who voted for whom and how and what their party is. And even there, people cannot tell the truth, even though they tend to. But they ended up having to be weighted and whatever, and they themselves can become controversial. Florida is some states don't even let you break down your registration by race and ethnicity. I will say that Florida data-wise is way ahead of a lot of the rest of the country, thankfully.
Good. Al, I saw your hand up.
Comment and a question, Doc. I'm not going to tell the crowd how many years ago it was when you were my mentor, because that wouldn't be good for either one of us. But I still think I get more out of listening to you talk for an hour than anybody I've ever listened to on any subject. So thank you. My question is actually reverting back to one of your slides and based on something you said when you were speaking to our ASPA local chapter about Hillsborough County. I think it was at the time of the 2016 election. And I want to use the word bellwether. I'm not sure that's the right one, but as an indicator, I think you said that Hillsborough County was considered the county that they focused on the most because whichever way that county went, that's generally the way the state went. And I believe you said in 2016, for the first time ever, it didn't go to Hillary. And you even tied it together with a great story about how I think it was Hillary's campaign manager got a headache at 5:30 and everybody said, "Where are you going?" And she said, "I go home, I don't feel well," which was the way you knew that Hillsborough wasn't going the way they thought it was going to go. So is that—
No, she went home and said she was drinking heavily. She went home and was drinking heavily. So,
Oh, okay. Well, but drinking heavily inappropriately because she thought that Hillary was going to win, right. And then she realized it wasn't going to happen. Is that still true? Is Hillsborough still considered a bellwether? If I'm using the right term?
That's a good question because really, there's been a number of national stories pointing to Pinellas this time. And Pinellas is looking there. No, seriously, a lot. I've done a lot of interviews about Pinellas, and Pinellas is looking more. Well, first of all, it's partisan divide. Hillsborough is becoming much bluer, and Pinellas is still pretty split. And you do get, if you think about the generational divide in Pinellas, and you get a better representation there, and also maybe not so much race, but still enough that it's meaningful. But then you also get the rural, urban, suburban kind of divide in Pinellas. And they've only been wrong. I forget what year it was. Somebody else may know, but they've only been wrong one time. Now they weren't in 2016. No one thought that the Republicans would win Pinellas, but they did what Republicans often do, and that's another thing that we're watching. They turn out consistently at a higher rate than Democrats. And that's where
And
that enthusiasm thing comes along. And so there's really no way to measure enthusiasm. Some people say, well, look at people in the streets and whatever, and who it is versus those who are kind of quiet. And that's where some people are giving Trump the edge on enthusiasm over Biden. I probably would agree with that. The issue is, will they also go vote? We don't know, but Republicans can gain over about 3 or 4% catch up registration wise for their higher turnout rates, depending on what a part of the state.
And if I could follow up with just a quick one, what motivated me or made me remember that was your slide on the gubernatorial race in 2018 that showed both Pinellas and Hillsborough as leaning Democratic, which surprised me only in the sense that I remembered what was said about the 2016 election. Is that kind of confirmed by what you just said? The influx of people, or it's subtly changing? Because frankly, I was surprised that DeSantis didn't carry, according to that, wouldn't have carried Pinellas County where he's from.
Well, sometimes, people do worse in the area they're from than they do other places. You've seen a number of times where presidential candidates have lost their home states and so forth. I think it was a turnout issue, and that's why, to my understanding, and this is again based on conversations with people, it's why Republicans in Pinellas and elsewhere just kept registering throughout from 2018 on. And, now Democrats are, well, we have to wait and see what the final numbers look like, because I think there was a surge on registration this last week, and we don't know what that's going to look like yet. But it is true that there's still now Democrats have the edge in Pinellas in terms of registration.
Great stuff. Thank you.
Hillsborough.
Thank you.
I think the three counties I look at most on election night myself is Pasco, Polk, and Manatee, because they're filled with working class family people, and they're often, the margin in those counties is what I kind of look at.
Awesome. Any questions? I know we're trying to do them through chat, but we have a fairly small audience. Sadly, I think you're right, Dr. MacManus. I'm a NASCAR fan, and I still feel that there's going to be that final lap wreck that we're going to have as we head into election day. So a couple minor wrecks and maybe one big blowout at the end, I think. But I think we all feel the same way. Any other questions from the room, real quick? Looking for a hand. I see Commissioner Eggers just popped on. Welcome, Commissioner Eggers. It was interesting. I'll say this, Dr. MacManus. We had the Pinellas County Supervisor of Elections on last month, and some of the questions was about voter fraud and is it really going to be a big issue? Your slides, and I'm going to go back and look at it. Your slides indicated that there are certain areas of it, but I think she said 32 states share registration data, and that really voter fraud is a very, very small amount of the total vote, where people are maybe potentially registered in 2 states. And do you see that to hold true in this area or in the state?
Yeah, I mean, we still have some problems with handling of vote by mail ballots. It tends to be, I don't want to be stereotypical, but it's evidentiary that the problems tend to be more intense in Southeast Florida, where you have these sort of ballot harvesters and people make money off of, going to nursing homes and helping people fill out ballots and all kinds of other things. But it is true that it's always of concern, but let me just put it this way. Already, the Biden campaign has hired over 6,000 attorneys. And the Trump campaign probably the same. And they're not all in Florida. Don't get me wrong, they're not all here. But we will have a sizable, because the stakes are so high, and you can see we have that reputation of being so close. I think the press is doing a lot better job, though, of telling people that there's a good reason why you won't know on election night who wins. 3 very good legal reasons to try to tamp down all the conspiratorial and those kinds of things, that rumors that go through like crazy. But number one, military ballots aren't due until 10 days after the election, so you can't count them, and overseas and military. Then secondly, anybody that goes to the polling location and doesn't have their ID, they can vote a provisional ballot. Those cannot be looked at and examined to see if the person's registered till after the election, done by a canvassing board, which is all open to the public. And the third is that if you have an onslaught of vote by mail ballots arriving the day or two or day of the election, you can't open all of them and check signatures and all that. So there are 3 reasons right there why in a state with 14 million registrants that there's, we saw, for example, Nikki Fried was losing on election night. And the next morning she was winning by the time we got some more. I think it took a couple of days, but she won the Commissioner of Agriculture because of these things that are perfectly legal, nothing shenanigans going on. But as I said earlier, most recent thing I looked at nationally, 2/3 of Americans do not think we're going to know on election night who won.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think they're all for very valid reasons. I think, and I was kind of shocked that, well, maybe not shocked, but that, when we had the supervisor elections, and I don't know, you would know better, that they have to be received. It's not postmarked in Florida. They have to physically be received at the election office at the close of the election. And is that the exception or the rule across the country?
Well, it was funny you mentioned that, because there was just a case that made it to the federal, I forget which one it is, Court of Appeal. I think it was North Carolina, but it could have been Georgia. I don't know which. But they have the same law as Florida, and a lower court judge had overturned that and said, no, they could not. They would have to take them on postmark. And the court ruled, no, it's the legislature's responsibility to make election law, and you can't be making it up at the last minute. So if someone were to bring that same lawsuit in Florida, it says precedent now on the Court of Appeals through another state. There are some that do have by postmark, but people forget that a lot of election laws are still in the hands of state and local officials rather than federal.
Right. Interesting. Any other questions? I thought I saw a hand somewhere. Trying to learn everything. Well, I think way better than expected. I expected great, and you knocked it out of the park with some of the statistical information. It was really tough to absorb everything, but it's interesting how deep of a dive you do. And Al's my neighbor. We had a conversation the other day about how great, as many times as I've seen you in person, seen you on TV, and listened to you on the radio, that you really delivered just statistical information. And I don't know where you lean, left, right, center, whatever it is, which I think really validates the information that you give. And I'm sure everybody in the room probably agrees with that you just present the numbers, which I think has always been amazing. So,
well, I guess in college, Al knows this, I actually studied budgeting and finance, and I've always been sort of a number person. So there you go. Thank you all. You've been very kind to put up with me for an hour. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. McManus. We
You're
appreciate it.
Best, Doc. You're still the best.
Take care.
Thank
All
you.
right. I miss all of you.
Have a great day. Get some sleep.
Bye. Thank
Bye.
you.